Every revolution starts in the minds of the people. Arm yourself for the war of ideas. Take back your life. Take back your liberty. Tom Mullen Talks Freedom.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Tom Mullen Talks Freedom. Today is Wednesday, April 23rd, 2025. So it just occurred to me as I was turning on the microphone here that I'm coming up on the 5-year anniversary of my canceling cable on principle. So it was during the god-awful year of 2020 when the government launched the, I would say, worst assault on our liberty in peacetime in American history. Peacetime, if we are in peacetime, are we ever in peacetime at any time in my lifetime? We're always bombing somebody, but we're not, of course, we haven't declared a war against anybody since in 80 years. And, even the undeclared wars are sometimes wars, or as Bill Maher said, we're just doing a little light bombing and we'll be out of your hair in a week kind of thing. So in any case, because of what I was observing with COVID, there came a time where I just did not want another dime of my money going to anybody at MSNBC, NBC, CNN, CBS, Fox News. And, one thing I want to remind you of is that even if you don't watch any of those, if you're boycotting them, but you still have a cable subscription, you're still paying them. So they're laughing at you. So I urge everybody to strike a blow for liberty and cancel your cable subscription. All I have here is internet. Now you might say, Tom, I see you use, these news sources all the time. And I do what I consider myself is spying on them. I spy on the news media. I use the internet to find out what they're telling everybody else. I don't use the news media to get informed because all the news media does is misinform you. But I do use, I spy on them to find out what bullshit they're peddling to you today so that I can debunk it in some cases, or at least react to it and have an idea of what delusions my fellow citizens are suffering under, the ones that still believe what they hear on there. So, I think the title of this episode is going to be something along the lines of Americans would make better political decisions if there were no news media at all. And I posted something to this effect on social media. And I wanted to put that idea together with some of the things I have been paying attention to. So I get plenty of content. Some of you might know I'm a Universal classic horror movie buff fan since I was like 6 years old. So those are all available on Amazon Prime. I also, of course, got into the whole Blu-ray thing so I could see even they shot a lot of those indoors. So the skies in a lot of those movies are just canvas and you could actually see the wrinkles in them when you have it on Blu-ray. But it just, to me, accentuates even more what tremendous artists these filmmakers were. They did all these things indoor on sound stages where they could somewhat control the sound, although some of it's rather echoey. And, just amazing talent, how much they could do with how little. And even when you get to the B movies, that's when it's really evident, because now you're talking about stuff that's shot in like 2 weeks and they still pull off all this atmosphere and tell you a story. Anyway, that's not why I, got on the mic today. I want to talk about the news media. And one of the things I have been binging on, great channel, America's Untold Stories. And it's hosted by, now I hope I don't get their names wrong, Eric Hunley, not Huntley. I keep calling him Huntley. It's Hunley, Hunley, and Mark Gruber, who's kind of a Renaissance man, wrote for National Lampoons, written movie scripts, done all kinds of stuff. But he evidently has been buried in the JFK assassination, research for many decades. And that's really what I like about their channel. I think they're both pretty hardcore Trumpers. And of course, because of that, I don't always agree with them. Sometimes I agree with them on current political news, but I completely agree with them on the JFK assassination. I think the official story, it's kind of like the official story of 9/11. Like you don't have to believe it was an inside job or whatever, but you got to believe that the official story is nonsense. The official story includes that they figured out who Muhammad Atta was because they found his wallet on the sidewalk under the like fell out of the plane, you know. So there's many reasons why they might be lying other than they planned it. And believe me, I don't, you know, rule out that it could all have been an inside job. I just don't know. But in any case, the JFK assassination almost certainly involved elements of the CIA, the mafia. You know, Roger Stone makes a very compelling case. I just finished his book. It's like 10 years old, but there's a whole funny story related to when that book came out and what I was doing at the time. But makes a strong case that LBJ was behind that. And that doesn't mean that if he was, whichever one, that the entire government and every agent who worked in the FBI and CIA and all the cabinet, that doesn't mean that they were all in on it. And I think that's one of the things, that's one of the straw men, you know, that's put out there about the JFK assassination conspiracy theories. You know, the term conspiracy theory was not invented by the CIA. You know, you can find it in books predating even the 20th century, but it was certainly made popular by the CIA in relation to anyone who questioned the Warren Commission version of the assassination, which was that Lee Harvey Oswald committed this crime all on his own. You know, he was a crappy shooter, but he still managed to hit Kennedy, a moving target, through the trees, you know, off Connolly, through off the Stone guy, as they, you know, just preposterous, right? So the reason that I bring this up is that I've been watching a lot of their videos. You know, you watch a video on YouTube, and then because you watched it, it serves you up another one, the algorithm. And a lot of people think this is sinister. I think it's like the greatest thing ever, okay? Because it finds you things that it thinks you might like. I love Spotify, even though I can't sell my CDs anymore because I have to put them up for free or no one's going to hear them. But that's fine with me. That's the new market. I don't mind that at all. If it wasn't for Spotify and the algorithm, I would have never heard of the coolest cat writing songs and releasing new music right now, Pokey Lafarge. Pokey, if by some ridiculous chance you ever hear this, I love you, man. Love your stuff. So anyway, they keep, you know, it keeps serving up more of these. Of course, I subscribe to their channel and I look for the JFK stuff. And I can't remember, they just had Paul Blow on their last episode. And I actually interviewed him when his book, The JFK Chokeholds, came out. I can't remember how far back it was, but as soon as he came on, I said, oh, geez, I know him. And I'll link to his book, certainly, or that episode, and you could go back and listen. But the reason I bring it up is I always knew that the media, you know, everyone knows Dan Rather was in on, you know, shaping the public perception of the assassination. You know, when you go and watch Johnny Carson, who I really liked as an entertainer, I love Johnny Carson. But when you see him interview Jim Garrison, it's very apparent he has an agenda. And he's not doing his civic duty to vet Garrison's claims. He's telling the American people what to think about Jim Garrison's claims. And especially when I saw that clip and some of the others where they either interview Garrison or other people challenging the Warren Commission version, that the lone nut Lee Harvey Oswald did it alone version that they want you to believe, I couldn't help but think about COVID now and how the media reporters behaved to anybody who questioned the COVID narrative. So we're talking when Garrison was prosecuting or investigating and then prosecuting Clay Shaw, this would be the late 1960s. So we're talking almost 60 years ago. It's been more than 60 since the Kennedy assassination. And then Garrison did not prosecute Shaw until 68 or 69. They didn't go to trial until then. And I don't know exactly how long his investigation took. 30 years ago, I could have told you every detail. So my history with the JFK assassination is I remember, first of all, as my surname indicates, I'm half Irish. My father was 100% Irish. He's second generation. His father and mother were born here, and then his grandfather was an immigrant from Ireland. And they all came from Scranton, Pennsylvania, where I guess there's like an Irish ghetto called the Notch. Anybody from Scranton, please comment. Tell me about the Notch. I may have Mullen relatives there. I never knew them. My mom is 100% Lebanese, and oh boy, you can't help knowing those relatives, whom I dearly love. But, you know, your second cousins are kind of like siblings in a Lebanese family. But on the Irish side, you know, when I was a kid and a really little kid, we would go to see my aunt, my grandmother's sister, in Niagara Falls, and they had pictures of Kennedy in every room. Now, this would have been late 60s, early 70s. I was a little kid. So he was already dead, obviously. But, you know, just being Irish, they had pictures of like Jesus and JFK, you know, and I didn't think there was anything strange about this when I was a kid. And they might have told me a few things. But of course, what do you know when you're 5 or 6 years old about politics? You know, knowing what I know now, I probably wouldn't vote for JFK in this 1960 election. Then again, I still consider his assassination one of the worst crimes of the century, besides the world wars, which were crimes as well. So in any case, what I knew about the assassination was just kind of what I was told by people like that. And then I remember being a little older in the 70s, there was like a special that came out about the trial of Lee Harvey Oswald. And I found this on YouTube, but I haven't watched it yet. I do remember watching it as a kid, but again, too young to put anything in perspective, but just it planted the seed that, you know, maybe the official story wasn't true. I remember Lorne Greene was in it. I can't remember if he played, I think the premise was that they're going to put Lee Harvey Oswald on trial, either posthumously or maybe in the movie he's still alive, like he lives to go to trial. Like I don't know, so I'm gonna watch it. But I do remember Lorne Greene like questioning and saying about people hearing all these shots coming from something called a grassy knoll. Now it's really weird, like I've never heard the word knoll used outside of archaic literature by anybody other than when they're talking about Dealey Plaza. So why they call it a knoll, I guess it's a hill. When you look at the pictures, it's a little hill, and at the top of it, there's a fence. And behind the fence, there's a parking lot. So I guess this is turning into way longer a story than need be for the point of this podcast, but I'm just kind of reliving my own experience with the JFK assassination. And so then, you know, I had the idea, you know, that this one guy shot the president's probably not true, or it might not be true. And I kind of forgot about that during the 80s when, you know, I wanted to be a rock and roll star and was in a band, was in a bunch of bands. And then the movie, Oliver Stone's movie, comes out in either 90 or 91. I can't remember. But I do remember it was at a time when the internet was in its infancy, and there might not have been a World Wide Web yet, so that if you wanted to use the internet, it wasn't like now where you just go on and type some words into a search engine and up pops all kinds of information. It wasn't like that. So I remember it wasn't until the mid 90s that I started doing that through my, phone connection. And I remember that, like, I got a job in 1993, and it was the first time I ever used email. And they had a thing called Fox Pro, which did what Excel now does, like spreadsheets. Anyway, So I see the movie and I'm like, wow, that's very persuasive, but it's a movie. And I did have the wherewithal to know that by that time, that when they make a movie about a historical event, they will change some things to make the story better. And I really don't have a problem with that. I'm going to the movies to be entertained. If I want to read history or, I would say pick up a history book, but most of those are baloney too. But, I know they're going to change things. Plus, because of my interest in the horror movies and all that, and just movies in general, I knew that, film is a different medium than prose, like books. Okay. So if you're going to do a film about a great book, you can't get every detail. You have to simplify some of the plot lines and things like that, even when you're doing historical fact, or you just can't make a movie. It would be 50 hours long, right? It's just impossible. So anyway, back then, no Google, no DuckDuckGo. I was like watching the credits and I saw Based on the Trail of the Assassins by Jim Garrison and Crossfire, the plot that killed Kennedy by Jim Marrs. And I got to remember that. I got to get those books. And I got those books. I read them both. And I was just into this totally at that point. And but at that point, it was like, oh, forget the movie, especially the Jim Marrs book just had so much information. And that was like my Bible on the Kennedy assassination because it was the only one I read. I read the Garrison book. And I'll tell you this, I believe Clay Shaw was involved and that researchers after the fact, have pretty much proven that. He was involved in something. He was working with the CIA, let's put it that way. Whether he was involved in the assassination directly, I don't know. Whether he was guilty of what Jim Garrison accused him of. Now, Garrison is pretty much considered a hero in the JFK researcher, conspiracy theorist, whatever you want to call them, community. The only thing I will throw out there is that prosecutors will hang on to a suspect, even if there's a lot of proof that the suspect's not guilty. So I'm not a slam dunk on Jim Garrison. I think he was probably right. He was certainly smeared so much by the media that I have a feeling he was right. Like if he was wrong, they wouldn't have cared so much. And it kind of brings me back to the subject of this podcast, which is, when you watch any of that, this has been the media, the official media. I don't like calling them the corporate press. I know some of my fellow libertarians do. And the reason I don't like that is because when people hear that, all they hear is that the problem is that they're for profit. Okay. And that's not the reason that the media is bad. Okay. Yeah. And I know someone will say, well, it's because they want to make money. Okay. Everybody wants to make money. Everybody. The alternative media wants to make money. I want to make money. And by the way, that means that you should subscribe to this podcast and become a paying member at my Substack. Incidentally, I always forget, if you become a paying member of the Substack, then you get transcripts of all the podcasts as a paying member. So if you want to, skim through some of my stories about my relatives, pictures of JFK on the wall, and get right to the meat on the bone, then as a paying Substack member, you could do that. But I know a lot of you are listening in the car or whatever, like I do for audio content. So anyway, it just was so striking to me to relive, some of the things I had seen, back in the 90s before the internet. You couldn't just watch clips of Johnny Carson. You had to wait for some special to come on. And of course, the special carried all the biases of the producers, some of whom were reaching too far or had the wrong conspiracy theory about the assassination or were misinformation. And that's one of the things the guys over at America's Untold Stories do, is like kind of expose the people who put out the wrong conspiracy theory on purpose to misdirect people away from who they believe were the real perpetrators. So in any case, nobody was served by the media back in the 1960s. Nobody was served in the 1990s when all this got rehashed. Nobody was served by the media on COVID. So let's say what the official fairy tale is. The official fairy tale is that, like the founders said, we need a free press to inform the public. And based on the information that the free press brings to the public, then, they can make informed political decisions using reason. Okay. If you believe that's what's happening based on what CNN or MSNBC or NBC believes, or what they put out as content, if you still believe that, or that at least they're pursuing that end, there's really no hope for you at this point. Seriously, nobody could believe it, except, of course, somebody who wants to believe it. And I think that's, I've said it before, there's the media all has one political bias. Fox News supposedly has a different one. And of course, they're the only station that has that one that's on cable news, right? On legacy media, traditional media, whatever you want to call it. And so all the rest, at least, tell people what those people want to hear, that their political bias is right, the other people are wrong. And of course, they're all on the side of the empire, right? Now, whether Trump is truly threatening the empire or not is a matter of discussion for another day, because, the first few weeks sounded something like that. The first few weeks was like a mixed bag. Yeah, he's kind of in the ballpark. There's a lot wrong with what he's doing, but at least he's challenging. Now he seems like, I don't know, what would be different if George W. Bush got back in there? Certainly nothing on Middle East policy, but I digress. So, when they wrote the First Amendment, and when, all that talk about the free press, they would be talking today about this podcast, or about America's Untold Stories, or about Joe Rogan, or Jimmy Dore, or any, those popular but not considered establishment, and by the establishment, not considered legitimate news sources. Okay. That's the free press that's challenging the government. See, the idea of the free press is that the government would try to exercise illegitimate power, and the free press would challenge that power, would challenge, and even if they might be disposed to agree with some new government policy, that they would vet it by attacking it, okay, in a reasonable way, so that the people reading their questions and the government's answers could say, well, has the government's case stood up to scrutiny? That's the idea behind the free press. That's the fairy tale, right? And again, that is happening on the internet news, on the alternative news. It's not happening at CNN. It's never happened at CNN, ever. Okay? There's never been a time in my life where the government wanted to expand its power and the media was in full court press opposing it. And I guess, like, somebody will come along and drop some stupid comment like, they do want abortion. Okay, fine. Abortion, and what would the other one be? Immigration, right? So the two things that the empire, the establishment wants, yes, all of a sudden they will find principles. They obviously have this depopulation thing. I don't think that they're going to try and kill us all. I don't necessarily believe that, like, the COVID vaccine is a scheme to kill hundreds of millions of people. I think it's probably more dangerous than something else that might have been vetted harder and not pushed by the regime. But, just that you have to go back to your anecdotal experience at some point and see if there's any confirmation there. And of course, we don't see bodies lying in the street from either COVID or the vaccine. So that one I don't buy, but I do buy that these elites would like a lot less of the rest of us around. They really would. And I know that because they say it all the time. And it's not just Bill Gates. This is a long-standing thing. I realize I'm getting excited, and I think I'm shaking my table, and I don't know how much is coming through on video, but I'm sorry about that. But in any case, in no case in my lifetime has the media done that thing the fairy tale says they're going to do. Never. Zero times. What they have done in every case is tell you how all their research and their hard-nosed reporting have turned up the conclusion that the latest expansion of the government into some new area of our lives is going to be better for us, that it's perfectly justified, that it's constitutional, whatever, every time. And so that should make you suspicious. And really, since the Operation Mockingbird was launched, it's been a complete success. Now we have former CIA directors hosting shows. They used to feel like they had to hide it a little more. Now it's not, it's like right out in the open. But, I would say about half of the experts you see brought on like they're just like some academic expert are intel. And you can pick them out pretty easily because I think I've told this story before, but like they just all of a sudden the talking points come out. Like right now they want their war for Iran again. I'm a little, I don't know, confused about what it is they exactly want with Iran because they've been pushing for this war for Iran for decades. And you would think that by now, since they've invaded the other 6 countries out of the 7 that were named by General Wesley Clark 20 years ago, on a plan he saw to invade 7 countries in the Middle East, that they would have got it by then. Now, we've had Colonel Douglas McGregor on the show numerous times, and he has said, and he is an expert, he's actually commanded troops in the field, not from, some office in Washington, that Iran would be a formidable foe. And the next time I have him, I need to ask him about my just pushback on that, knowing that they have like no money at all. Like their defense budget's something like 15 billion a year. Their whole GDP is less than our defense spending. So how they could be, maybe that's not true. It is true. I think their GDP's in the hundreds of billions. And our defense spending is going to be $1 trillion this year, at least according to the president who promised to cut it early on in his presidency when they first started the Doge thing. So anyway, I just don't see how Iran puts up that big a fight. But then again, you look at Russia's defense budget and it's like 1/10 of the United States, yet they're able to fight a war and really defeat not just Ukraine, but all of NATO. Certainly they're not defeating the United States kinetically, but they're defeating the United States money and all of NATO's money on about 1/10 of what the United States spends during peacetime. So anyway, the other thing I'll say about, the JFK stuff and the media, that at the time, the alternative media were labeled conspiracy theorists. And those were the people that Madison was talking about when he wrote the First Amendment. The freedom to publish controversial ideas was not by the establishment media during the colonial times. And there's a quote in my first book, and I didn't open the PDF and I won't take the time to do it now, but there's a chapter on the media in my first book, A Return to Common Sense. And there's a quote from Thomas Jefferson basically saying that the king always had, his, I don't know what he calls them, news writers or journalists, or I don't think they use those words. His press around to push the official narrative. There's a quote, words to that effect in chapter 8 of my book, A Return to Common Sense. So this was a problem even in colonial America. It's been a problem since we've had governments that they have propagandists holding themselves up as informers of public opinion. And they're not, and they never have been. And during the Kennedy years, the conspiracy theorists, the kooks, not all of them, because some of them were kooks, but most of them, and especially the ones whose work has survived, they were the people that the First Amendment was written for. And of course, the establishment tried to destroy them, and in some cases did destroy them. In some cases, eliminated them physically, like they're no longer with us from some mysterious accident. Okay. And they're the same people who challenged COVID that now all of a sudden we have a government department for misinformation. I know that's supposedly gone with Trump, but I guess it's back now, because if you say anything that's perceived as anti-Semitic, now you could be canceled or worse, or jailed or whatever. I don't think that they've tried to prosecute an American citizen. They're using it mainly against illegal immigrants right now, and again, libertarians told the conservatives back in 2002 and 2003, watch what you're doing here. All this Patriot Act, Military Commissions Act of 2000, all this stuff's going to be used against you someday. And of course, we were right with the J6 stuff and all that. And no, they haven't learned, because they're doing it again. But it's like some things never change. The COVID the COVID skeptics were the people the First Amendment was written for, not CNN. Okay. That brings me to my conclusion that we would all make better decisions if there were no news media whatsoever. And there's, I guess, two ways to push back on it. One would be like, well, look, if you only have when I say no news media, the establishment media, if there was no CNN, no NBC, no CBS, no ABC, none of it, Fox News, it all just disappeared, and there was none. And I think one bit of pushback would be like, well, then the internet runs wild, and there's a lot of, real crap on the internet, and there is. But that, number one, that doesn't matter. First of all, that's the whole idea, is that we have of the First Amendment, is that the people have the right to decide what's crap and what isn't. Each individual does. I don't like the people, the mob. To me, we the people means we the mob. Okay. That's what I don't like about the Constitution. What I do like about the Constitution is all in the parts that got put in there by like the Anti-Federalists. Like they demanded a Bill of Rights to say, here's all the things the government's not allowed to do. So the Bill of Rights wasn't part of the original Constitution. It's a reaction to it. And one of them is you can't suppress freedom of speech or of the press. And again, the press they're talking about are the dissidents, the ones they want to stamp out right now. And so anyway, the one thing is like all you'd have is every Tom, Dick, and Harry. And this recent brouhaha over Dave Smith and Douglas Murray is a perfect example. And Murray doesn't have any arguments. It's just that, who are you to talk about these things? Oh, you haven't been to Israel. Okay, I haven't been to Ireland or Lebanon. My relatives used to come over from Lebanon when the fighting got too near their house from the Lebanese Civil War, which was a direct product, by the way, of creation of the state of Israel. So Lebanon was a majority Christian country, and when they created Israel, millions of Palestinian refugees fled into Lebanon. And that, and during the 1967 war, another wave of refugees, and all of a sudden you have a majority Muslim country. So, I'm sure that'll be clipped somewhere. And oh my God, anti-Semitism. I really don't have an opinion about all that. I don't care about Lebanon or Israel or Ireland. I care about the United States of America, where I live, where I was born. I consider myself an American. And that's why I would rather that my fellow libertarians aren't out there like, condemning what's happening over there or supporting it. I just don't want my money going there. And we have no business interfering there. And that's the extent of what I want to say, because that's really the non-interventionist position. It's really the Ron Paul position, even though he's not an anarchist by any means. But he said, Israel has a right to defend themselves. We just shouldn't interfere. And our interference changes the way that they do respond. Okay. So I would, my position is I don't want us to be involved at all. And then, this is not 1948. Israel is not a helpless country. They have hundreds of nuclear weapons, by the way. All right. They're not going to be stamped out by the other Muslim countries. And a lot of them would like to work with Israel because they don't like the nuts, the real extreme nut jobs, the Muslim, Islam, extremist Islamists either. So anyway, I don't want to digress into all that. We'll do a separate episode on that. But of course, full court press on stamping out Dave Smith now. And all the usual suspects are out there. We're the establishment. We're the experts. What right do you have to even talk about this? Unbelievable. So that's been the media for all my life. Okay. We didn't realize it before the internet because we just thought like everyone else thought the same way. So the internet is still useful, even though it's been massively co-opted by Intel as well. And, of course, Google and Facebook were all mixed up in that. I don't know what Mark Zuckerberg's story is, trying to extricate himself somehow. But in any case, that's the alternative media is the only useful one. And, oh, yeah, my second point. So, okay, you'd have everybody running wild on the internet if there was no supposedly, official established media with people from all the Ivy League schools, the experts. And then we would just decide, well, which of these make a case? It's up to you to ask follow-up questions, not just believe something because it's contrarian, okay? Or you don't have a free country. If you're not equipped to do that, then you can't have a free country, because that's what it's based on. That you, the average schmuck, me, the average schmuck, has the wherewithal to just ask follow-up questions and see if the latest thing, whether it's pitched by some guy in a Unabomber hut on the internet or Joe Scarborough on MSNBC, whether it holds up to scrutiny. And the other thing that I'll just say about the establishment media before I get to my second reason why we would be better off without them is when you're watching a subject discussed on national media and you're sitting there saying, how could you not ask this follow-up question? Any, 10th grader with a functioning brain would have asked, okay, like I'll give you an example. I don't even know why they went this far, but they brought Slavitt. I can't remember his first name. I think he was CDC something or other. He wasn't director because that was Walensky, it's a woman. But they brought Andrew Slavitt on. It was either NBC or MSNBC, and that socialist reporter, Stephanie something or other, yeah, I'm just going from memory here, actually asked him. She said, well, look you're doing all these things in California, are following, very strict lockdowns and mask policies. And in Texas, they've just got rid of them and all. And we can't see a difference in the result. And that's an anomaly to my paradigm. I'll just admit I'm surprised that question was even asked of Slavitt. And I don't know if it was so much pressure that even they were worried about somebody's got to ask this, or we're going to be accused of just being completely a propaganda. I don't know what the reason for it. Stephanie Ruhle, by the way, that's her name. Pretty sure. Commie through and through. Anyway, she asked Slavitt this question, and his answer is, well, there's a lot we don't know about COVID. But we do know that social distancing works, masks work, And she just moves on and lets that answer stand. Now, first of all, he says there's a lot we don't know about COVID. but they've been dictating things to us that from a position is we do know. Okay. And then he said, but we do know masks work and lockdowns work and socialism. Okay. Well, the obvious follow-up question that anybody, like, don't need a journalism degree, don't need a degree in anything, your first day on the planet, okay, would be, well, no, Andrew, we don't know that, because the whole reason I asked the question is they're not doing these things in Texas and they're getting no different results. Okay. So that seems to indicate that we don't know that masks work, that we don't know that lockdowns work, that we don't know that social distancing works. Okay. And I think this is early in the vaccine story, so we weren't even there yet with the vaccine. So she doesn't ask that question or anything akin to it. She lets his answer stand. Why? Because she doesn't want the answer to that. She does not want to challenge him and make him back up his answer. Okay? Why did she ask the question? I don't know. Now, anybody watching, I think people watching who were in favor of all of that for political reasons, and there's all kinds of motivations to be in favor of lockdowns, to be in favor of mask mandates, like that. They liked his answers. Yep, see, he said there's a lot we don't know, but we do know these things work. And that was good enough for them. Okay? But there is no sense in his answer. If the whole question is we have two places, one's doing, procedure A and one is not doing procedure A, and they're both getting the same results, then your conclusion from that scientifically cannot be we know procedure A works. You have to explain, if it works, why they're not getting bad results in the other place where they're not doing it. Okay? Now, two examples does not a scientific conclusion make. But guess what? We've had numerous studies now, very conclusive studies that say nothing COVID did work. It made no difference in terms of COVID. Okay. So apart from all the societal damage lockdowns might have done, they had no effect on COVID outcomes. Zero. Harvard and Stanford scientists conducted a conclusive study on this. These are probably liberals who just happen to be intellectually honest. They found that no government policies had any effect on COVID. Now, the Trump administration has pretty much just come out and said this on the covid.gov website. That's now the official story. Now, you could say that's just because Trump's in charge, whatever. The official story before, you could say, was just because Biden's or the Democrats were in charge, whoever was in charge when Biden was the figurehead. Okay. But in any case, the official story is that they had no effect. Now, when you go to covid.gov, you're going to see a whole thing, about it came from China, the lab leak. I'm not as interested in that. I have no doubt it was a ginned up virus based on gain of function research. Okay. And it probably got out by accident, could have been released on purpose. Who knows? It wasn't that bad, is the first thing. Okay. That kind of obscures the fact that it wasn't that. It was way overhyped. It was nowhere near as dangerous as they made it out. And like those people that are pushing the whole China thing would still like to live one foot in this world and one foot in the other, where lockdowns and masks and all that. Now, even if it was a dangerous virus, those things weren't going to work. So I guess you could have a foot in both camps, but in any case, that's the official story now. But the history books are going to write what they wrote about, like antitrust and Teddy Roosevelt being a trust buster. Now, none of that is true. Like, there's no part of the story that you learn in school about Teddy Roosevelt in the early progressive era and the New Deal. Zero of that is true. But that's the official story. That's what people learn in school. And someday they will learn in school there was this very dangerous virus, whether they admit it came out of a U.S. funded lab or not, or I don't know. But that, people like Anthony Fauci saved the day. despite pushbacks from the rubes who tried to inhibit his. That's what your grandchildren are going to learn that in school, right? Play this for them if you live that long after I'm gone, and me saying that, and it's none of it's true. And right now, no science says it's true. So we'd be better off. Okay. So the second part, and this is it, and then I'll wrap up. The second part of my reasoning behind that is that you don't need objective facts to make political decisions. Okay. You can make political decisions based purely on a priori reasoning, because political decisions are all about how the use of violence is deployed with impunity. Okay, when can we use violence and not suffer retribution? If I can't just go out and hit someone over the head, I'm either that person's going to hit me back, or somebody's going to come along and prosecute me, right? And even if there were no government, institutions would arise to get restitution for that person I hit over the head. Okay, so this is really every political decision. And when I say, how can we use violence? All government action is based ultimately on the threat of violence. Okay. If you do not comply, men with guns will come and drag you away, put you in a cage. If you resist too hard, they'll shoot you. Sometimes you don't even have to resist that hard, but that is violence. That's the whole reason to have a government, is to institutionalize that. And supposedly, the way it was sold to us by the classical liberals, to defend the rights of people who can't defend themselves. But no one ever questioned that it was violence. So the question comes down to be like this institutionalized, controlled institution of violence. How should it be deployed? Under what circumstances? For what reasons? And how executed, for lack of a better word. Okay? So every political question, should the government fund Ukraine? Okay? So the justification in our Constitution would be, and when I say fund Ukraine, fund the war in Ukraine, that, that the government has war powers that are there for the defense of the people who pay for the government. And so those war powers should only be used if the government declares war on the other country. And if you look back at how that power used to be executed, it was always in response to an act of war by the other country, not against some country 6,000 miles away, against the United States. Now, a lot of those were just ginned up. You might say all of them were. Okay, definitely the Mexican-American War, they knowingly went in and got the Mexicans to fire the first shot. A lot, basically the same way Lincoln did to the Confederates. And you could argue that's what Wilson did. And that's what FDR did for sure. Wilson, it's a little more complex. But in any case, no one in Ukraine or Russia has committed an act of war against the United States. There's no declaration of war. So offensive, there's nothing in the Constitution that says go fund other countries. Okay. There is a power to make an alliance, which is a very bad power, but we have no treaty with Ukraine. So, of course, constitutionally, there's just no basis for funding the Ukraine war. So you could get, the bottom line is, and I can make it even more simple, if you wanted to make political decisions not even based on constitutionality, but based on individual rights, which are all property rights, do I have the right to force somebody else to fund the Ukraine war? No. Okay. Well, then how am I delegating that to the government if I can't do it and no other person can do it? And basically, that's even a tougher, longer discussion since there is this treaty power. But do I have the right to go and force my neighbor to pay for the public school? No, So do I have the right to intervene if my neighbor is attacked by another person? Armed robbery. Yes, I do. Okay. Unlike forcing him to pay for somebody else's schooling, I do have the right to intervene directly in that and shoot the robber or otherwise defend him or, go and find this robber and make him give back the money and some extra for the trouble or whatever. Okay. This is a right I would have if there were no government. So yes, I can delegate that. Look, again, I'm an anarcho-capitalist. I don't even think you can delegate that. I don't think you can justify that. And Murray Rothbard's argument was, look, if you can, that protection you're talking about, that justice you're talking about, it's just another service like education. So if you can justify delegating that to the government, then you can justify everything else. But that's not how the classical liberal government was built. There was a clear distinction between, and John Locke said this right in the essay that Jefferson said you have to read to understand American liberty and natural rights. He said that the government can have no power that's not possessed by the individual. So if you just use that basis to make all political decisions and you didn't have any information that is supposedly provided by the news media, you would make much better political decisions. We'd have a much smaller government. We'd have more peace. We'd have more freedom. We'd have more prosperity. There'd be less poor people. Just go right down the line with every societal problem you can think of, and there would be less of it if people made decisions based on that a priori reasoning and applying property rights, the only real rights, all springing from self-ownership. And that's what they made their political decisions on. And they had no idea what was going on in Ukraine or Israel or Latin America or anywhere else. And they just made their decisions based on applying those principles. We would have a freer country and a better country. So yes, you could get rid of the whole media. Let's say you could get rid of the whole media and shut down the internet. So you'd even have the alternative media. You'd still make better political decisions based on no information whatsoever. And here comes what if you didn't know that? Those principles still apply to political decisions. The consequences should not figure in to your political decisions or the predicted consequences from the CIA infested media. Okay. What you find occurs is that when you apply property rights consistently, you get better outcomes. Look at China. That's by no means a free country. But the difference between China today and China when I was a kid and everybody was starving, and literally my mother used to say, don't waste your food, people are starving in China. The difference is that they apply property rights better now than they did back then. They don't do it well, and neither does the United States, but they do it better than they used to. And that's why they're richer. That's why they're doing better societally. So, there's my case, and that's why I say, don't think that, I don't like them. They spin. They're not so great, but I have no other choice. I can't just cancel cable and not watch the news. I have a duty as a citizen to at least know what's going on before I make none of that's true. Cancel it right now. You will make better decisions not watching anything than you would if you watch the news. And I'll see you next time.
The War of Ideas has only just begun. Arm yourself with the knowledge you need by heading to TomMullenTalksFreedom.com and subscribing to our email list. And remember, every revolution starts in the minds of the people.